in the heart of Central Europe, amidst the opulent courts of the Holy Roman Empire, a girl was born who would one day play a pivotal role in the history of a distant kingdom. This princess was Catherine of Austria. Born in 1533 to Ferdinand I of the Holy Roman Empire and Anna of Bohemia and Hungary. Her birth would be the beginning of a journey that intertwined her fate with royal families across Europe, eventually leading her to the distant shores of Portugal. The Habsburg dynasty, a powerhouse of Europe. Catherine's early years were shaped by the powerful Habsburg family, one of the most influential dynasties of Europe. The Habsburgs were known not just for their vast territories, stretching across modern-day Austria, Hungary, Spain, and the Low Countries, but for their relentless pursuit of strategic marriages to strengthen their empire. Ferdinand I, her father, was a key figure in the Habsburg dynasty, reigning as the Holy Roman Emperor after his brother Charles V stepped down. The court in Vienna was a dazzling place, filled with scholars, musicians, and diplomats. Here, Catherine was raised among the finest minds in Europe, and from a young age, she was taught the arts of diplomacy, court etiquette, and religion. Catherine's education was not solely focused on the academic but also on preparing her for the life of a royal consort, an art that required as much tact as it did diplomacy. A marriage of politics, preparing for the future. The Habsburgs' strategic marriages were legendary, and Catherine was no exception to this. From the moment she was born, her future was already mapped out in a web of political alliances. She was betrothed to Henrique of Portugal, a royal who would later ascend the throne as King Henrique I of Portugal. But at the time, he was known as Cardinal Henrique, a man deeply entrenched in religious affairs. At the age of just 10, Catherine was promised to Henrique, marking the beginning of a political alliance between the Habsburgs and the Kingdom of Portugal. The marriage would unite two powerful Catholic families and solidify ties between their two kingdoms. Ferdinand I, seeking to secure Portugal's loyalty to the Holy Roman Empire, saw Catherine's union with Henrique as an essential part of his diplomatic strategy. But the marriage was not just a union of two individuals, it was a strategic move that would echo through European politics for decades to come. In the years that followed, Catherine's upbringing was a mixture of the religious devotion expected of a royal and the political acumen necessary to navigate the turbulent world of European diplomacy. She learned the languages of diplomacy, the intricacies of courtly life, and how to influence those around her through grace and subtlety. A royal life of education and preparation. By the time Catherine reached her teenage years, her life was already one of responsibility. As a daughter of the Habsburg family, her role was clear. She was not just a princess but a future queen consort with the weight of political expectations upon her. Her education became a careful balance between personal development and the preparation needed for her future role. Catherine was well versed in the Latin language and studied the works of the great thinkers of the time. She became proficient in matters of theology, philosophy, and law, subjects that were not just academic but practical for a woman who would one day help govern a kingdom. However, it was her lessons in diplomacy and political maneuvering that would prove most valuable in her later life, particularly in her marriage to Henrique. At the Habsburg court, Catherine was exposed to the volatile world of European politics, an arena where alliances were often forged through marriage and broken through betrayal. The political landscape was shifting rapidly. The Protestant Reformation had divided Europe, and Catholic monarchs like her family were looking for ways to combat the spread of Protestantism. Catherine was aware that her marriage to Henrique would not only unite two Catholic families but would also be an opportunity to bolster the influence of the Catholic Church in Portugal, a country where the monarchy and the Church had long been intertwined. The princess prepared for a royal marriage. Catherine's marriage to Henrique was arranged when she was just 10 years old, a common practice for European royals at the time. However, it was not until she was a young woman that the union was finalized, with the marriage taking place in 1543. Despite the political nature of this match, it would not be without its challenges. Henrique was already a prominent figure in the Catholic Church, having been made a cardinal in his youth, and as such, he had a deep religious devotion that would define much of his reign. Catherine, too, shared a strong faith, which would come to shape her time in Portugal. It was clear that their marriage would be one of mutual respect for their religious convictions. but also one marked by the heavy responsibilities of ruling a kingdom and preserving its alliances in an increasingly unstable Europe. Their union symbolized not only the connection between the two royal families but also the role that Catherine would play in supporting Henrique I and the complex political landscape of 16th-century Europe. Catherine was not simply a royal consort, she was a diplomat in her own right. Tasked with navigating the difficult waters of court politics, foreign alliances, and her husband's religious commitments. The end of an era, the changing dynamics of Europe. As Catherine and Henrique prepared for their marriage, Europe was at a crossroads. The Protestant Reformation had divided the Catholic world, and tensions between Catholic and Protestant monarchs were escalating. At the same time, the Habsburgs were navigating their own internal struggles, as Ferdinand I's rule was becoming increasingly defined by the need to balance the competing powers of Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. The marriage of Catherine and Henrique would not just be a political alliance, it would be a critical element in the broader strategy of the Habsburg family to maintain Catholic dominance across Europe. For Catherine, it was not just a union with a man but a step into a world of political intrigue and religious conflict. The role she would play in the years to come would not be one of passive elegance, but one of active involvement in the fate of two kingdoms. In this first chapter of Catherine's life, we see the foundation being laid for what would become a remarkable and tumultuous journey. Her early years were shaped by the weight of royal expectations, and as her marriage to Henrique loomed on the horizon, she could not have known how pivotal she would become in the political and religious affairs of Europe. As the years passed, Catherine's life became increasingly entwined with the political tides of Europe. She was no longer just a princess in a distant court, but a future Queen Consort of Portugal, preparing for a role that would require not only grace and diplomacy but also an understanding of power and control in a time of turbulence. The engagement, a diplomatic maneuver. In 1543, when Catherine was still in her early teens, the formal engagement to Henrique of Portugal, the Cardinal of the Kingdom of Portugal, was finalized. This arrangement was the culmination of years of diplomatic planning between the Habsburgs and the Portuguese monarchy. Catherine's father, Ferdinand I, sought to solidify a strategic alliance with Portugal, whose political stability was precarious due to the looming succession crisis following the death of King John III of Portugal. Catherine's marriage to Henrique was a crucial step in ensuring that the Habsburgs had a strong foothold in the Iberian Peninsula and that Portugal remained aligned with the Holy Roman Empire. The match between Catherine and Henrique was not one forged purely out of love. It was a strategic political alliance, meant to strengthen ties between two influential Catholic powers. Henrique, although a prominent cardinal, had become a significant figure in Portuguese politics. Despite his ecclesiastical status, his ambition was to one day ascend to the throne of Portugal. Catherine, being raised in the imperial court of the Habsburgs, was well aware of the nature of such arrangements. However, she also understood that her position would offer her the opportunity to exert influence over one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Henrique, in contrast, was an enigmatic figure. While he held high religious office as a cardinal, his personal desires had long extended beyond the church. A deeply devout man, Henrique's life in the ecclesiastical world had not prevented his growing interest in the Portuguese throne. In fact, it was his close ties to the royal family of Portugal that allowed him to maneuver his way into the political scene. His ascension to the throne, however, was far from guaranteed, and many viewed his future as uncertain, especially since the Portuguese crown had been historically passed through male heirs. The marriage, a royal union for stability. When Catherine traveled to Portugal for the marriage ceremony, she was greeted with the splendor and gravity that came with being a member of the Habsburg family. Yet, the ceremony itself was just one part of a much larger picture. The marriage was not merely a union between two individuals, it was a grand political statement that would send ripples through the royal courts of Europe. In 1543, Catherine, then just 10 years old, was formally betrothed to Henrique, though the marriage would not occur until Catherine reached maturity. During these early years, Catherine would have been kept at the Habsburg court in Vienna, while Henrique, already an influential religious and political figure, continued his work in Portugal. The separation between them was substantial, yet their communication, whether through letters or emissaries, reinforced the growing importance of this union. Catherine's role in the marriage, though still young, was that of a diplomat in training. She understood the gravity of her future role, not just as a wife, but as a powerful consort who would one day rule by Henrique's side. From her father, Ferdinand I, she learned the delicate balance between maintaining loyalty to her family's interests and serving the needs of her new home. The marriage was as much about power dynamics as it was about personal connection. Though over time, Catherine would come to respect her husband for his deep religious devotion and his strategic mind. Henrique, for his part, had been thoroughly prepared for his eventual union with Catherine. Raised in the royal court of Portugal, Henrique had been groomed for a life of political leadership. Though he had chosen the ecclesiastical path as a cardinal, his ambitions always extended beyond the walls of the church. Henrique had spent much of his life working to position himself as a key figure in the future of the Portuguese monarchy. And Catherine's marriage to him was a critical component of this plan. The arrival in Portugal, the start of a new chapter. In the years that followed the marriage agreement, Catherine finally made her way to Portugal, where she would live as a royal consort. By the time she arrived in Lisbon, she was well versed in the complex web of politics and religion that defined European courts. Portugal, however, was a kingdom in turmoil. Under King John III, Portugal had been experiencing a series of struggles, both with external threats and internal conflicts. The death of King John III in 1557, followed by the loss of his direct heir, the young Sebastião I, added to the uncertainty that hung over the kingdom. For Catherine, this uncertain political climate was both a challenge and an opportunity. As a member of the Habsburg family, her influence was critical in helping to stabilize the kingdom during these turbulent times. However, her primary role was to support Henrique, who, despite being a cardinal, had his eyes set on the Portuguese throne. The marriage between Catherine and Henrique was, therefore, not just an alliance between two individuals, but also a union between two countries at a time of considerable political instability. Catherine, as the Habsburg princess, helped solidify Portugal's ties with the Holy Roman Empire, ensuring that the Kingdom of Portugal would remain a loyal Catholic power in the face of growing tensions in Europe. The early years of their marriage, though their marriage began as a political arrangement, over time, Catherine and Henrique developed a deep respect for each other. Henrique, a man of faith, found in Catherine not just a partner in diplomacy but a woman whose intelligence and diplomatic skills complemented his own. Their marriage allowed both to exert influence on Portuguese politics. Catherine, with her deep understanding of Habsburg diplomacy, helped Henrique navigate the intricacies of court politics and alliances, ensuring that Portugal could stand strong amidst the shifting political alliances of the time. Catherine's role was not limited to her status as consort. She was a woman of great intellect and political astuteness, and she quickly became an important advisor to Henrique. While he focused on religious matters and his political ambitions, Catherine worked behind the scenes, managing relationships with other European powers and strengthening her family's position in Portugal. At the same time, Catherine's presence in Portugal also helped calm the anxieties of the Portuguese court. Her diplomatic connections and ties to the Habsburgs provided a sense of stability, particularly in the wake of King John III's death. Though the political landscape of Portugal was fraught with uncertainty, Catherine's influence ensured that the Habsburgs would continue to have a strong say in the future of the kingdom. Catherine's political savvy, a woman of power. Catherine was not merely a passive participant in her marriage to Henrique, she was an active player in shaping the course of events. Through her political acumen and deft diplomacy, she secured Portugal's place in a rapidly changing European order. Her marriage to Henrique allowed her to maintain a delicate balance between the interests of her birth family, the Habsburgs, and her new home in Portugal. Her early years in Portugal marked the beginning of her significant role in Portuguese politics. As she navigated the complex relationship between the Church, the Crown, and the wider European powers, as a royal consort, Catherine was instrumental in managing diplomatic relationships, positioning Portugal as a staunch ally of the Habsburgs, while ensuring that the kingdom remained loyal to the Catholic faith in the face of the Protestant Reformation. This political partnership, forged in marriage, would come to define not just Catherine's role in Portugal, but also her influence on Henrique I's eventual reign. Catherine's life in Portugal began with the weight of royal expectation placed firmly upon her shoulders. She was not only a consort to Henrique I but also a key figure in a kingdom undergoing both religious and political turbulence. Her arrival in Lisbon marked the beginning of a delicate balancing act between her Habsburg lineage and her role in stabilizing Portugal's fragile political environment. The arrival in Portugal, a kingdom in flux. By the time Catherine arrived in Lisbon, the political landscape of Portugal had been shaken by a series of crises. King John III, who had ruled Portugal for nearly 3 decades, passed away in 1557, leaving the throne to his son Sebastião I. However, Sebastião was just a child, and the kingdom struggled with leadership in the years following his coronation. In 1568, King Sebastião embarked on a disastrous military campaign against the Moors in Morocco, which culminated in the Battle of Alcaquibir in 1578. The battle ended in a catastrophic defeat, with Sebastião vanishing and presumed dead, leaving the throne without a direct heir. This created a power vacuum and a national crisis, particularly for the House of Aviz, the royal family of Portugal. The situation was worsened by the fact that no one knew for certain whether Sebastião had died in the battle or whether he had survived, potentially to return and reclaim the throne. As the nation grappled with the uncertainty of succession, Catherine, who had arrived in Portugal years earlier, found herself in a position of greater influence than ever before. Henrique I, her husband, had long been considered a candidate for the throne, though he was a cardinal in the Catholic Church. However, as the uncertainty surrounding the throne deepened, and with the lack of a clear male heir, Henrique's ambitions were elevated, positioning him as a key figure in the future of Portugal. Despite his ecclesiastical status, Henrique was a man with royal blood, and many felt he was the best option to provide stability to the kingdom. A diplomatic and religious anchor, Catherine's role in the wake of these crises was not merely symbolic. As a princess of the Habsburg family, she had access to significant diplomatic channels and was able to leverage her connections to strengthen the political position of Portugal. Her family, the Habsburgs, were major players in European politics, with Ferdinand I serving as Holy Roman Emperor and his brother Charles V having ruled over vast territories. Through Catherine, the Portuguese monarchy had the opportunity to align itself with the Habsburgs, ensuring support from one of the most powerful Catholic families in Europe. Catherine was a devout Catholic, and her religious convictions aligned perfectly with those of Henrique. Together, they worked to ensure that Portugal remained firmly Catholic in the face of the growing influence of Protestantism throughout Europe. The Reformation had begun to alter the religious landscape across Europe, and Catholic monarchs like Catherine and Henrique were determined to prevent Protestant ideas from taking hold in their kingdoms. Portugal's Catholic identity was not only a matter of faith but a crucial part of its political stability. By maintaining close ties to the Habsburgs and reinforcing the Catholic faith, Catherine and Henrique aimed to protect the kingdom from both internal and external threats. This political and religious collaboration helped solidify Catherine's influence in Portugal, not just as a wife and consort but as an active political figure who understood the delicate balance between diplomacy, faith, and governance. Catherine's political influence at court. Despite her relatively quiet demeanor, Catherine's political influence at the Portuguese court was undeniable. She did not act as a passive figure beside her husband, rather, she became an advisor and a strategist in her own right. The political chaos following Sebastião I's disappearance meant that Catherine was deeply involved in key decisions that affected the future of the kingdom. As a member of the Habsburg family, Catherine had the experience and the connections to mediate between different factions within Portugal. There were numerous factions vying for power in the wake of the throne's vacancy. Some saw Henrique as the natural successor, while others looked to more distant members of the royal family. Catherine used her diplomatic skills to manage these factions, leveraging her ties with the Habsburgs and the Church to maintain stability and push for Henrique's coronation. In addition to her diplomatic efforts, Catherine's religious influence was also critical in shaping the direction of Portugal's future. Her strong Catholic beliefs resonated with the people of Portugal, who were facing both external threats from Protestant powers and internal divisions. By publicly supporting Henrique's rule and championing the Catholic cause, Catherine helped maintain the religious cohesion that was central to Portugal's identity. Henrique's ascension to the throne. In 1578, after the disastrous battle and the uncertainty of Sebastião I's fate, it became increasingly clear that the Portuguese monarchy needed strong leadership. Henrique's rise to the throne was inevitable, given the absence of any clear successor. Though Henrique was still technically a cardinal, his political ambitions and his strong claim to the throne could no longer be ignored. With Catherine's support and the backing of the Church, Henrique was crowned as King Henrique I of Portugal in 1578. Catherine's role in this process was multifaceted. She was not just the wife of the king but a key advisor, guiding Henrique through the complicated political landscape of the time. Her experience in courtly diplomacy and her ability to navigate the intricacies of European politics were invaluable to Henrique as he prepared to take on the mantle of the Portuguese crown. She acted as his most trusted advisor, managing the royal court's internal politics and ensuring that the kingdom remained aligned with the Catholic powers of Europe. Despite the uncertainty surrounding the throne and the kingdom's future, Catherine's influence helped Henrique assert his rule and gain support from both the nobility and the people. Her political savvy and diplomatic connections proved to be essential in the delicate negotiations that followed. And her role in the early days of Henrique I's reign cannot be overstated. Catherine's personal struggles, the price of power. While Catherine's political influence was growing, her personal life was filled with struggles. The absence of direct heirs to the throne from her marriage to Henrique weighed heavily on her, as the stability of the kingdom depended on a secure line of succession. As a devout Catholic, Catherine was unable to produce the male heir that Portugal desperately needed, which created further uncertainty and put additional pressure on her marriage and her role as consort. However, Catherine's commitment to her husband and her kingdom never wavered. She supported Henrique through the difficult process of securing his rule, working tirelessly to ensure that Portugal remained a unified and Catholic kingdom. Despite the personal strain of not being able to bear an heir, Catherine remained steadfast in her dedication to the kingdom's welfare, understanding that her role was not just to produce heirs but to secure the future of Portugal in a rapidly changing world. The road ahead. Challenges and uncertainties. As the early years of Henrique I's reign progressed, Catherine's role in Portugal continued to evolve. The kingdom was still reeling from the shock of Sebastião I's disappearance and the subsequent uncertainty about the throne. Catherine's support for Henrique was essential in maintaining stability. But the future of the Portuguese monarchy remained uncertain. Catherine's influence would only grow as the political and religious challenges facing Portugal intensified. The looming threat of Spanish domination, the lack of a clear heir to the throne, and the growing tensions between the Catholic and Protestant powers of Europe would all play a crucial role in shaping her legacy and her impact on the Kingdom of Portugal. Her strength, resilience, and ability to navigate the complex web of European politics and religion would define her legacy as one of the most influential royal consorts of her time. In the annals of Portugal's history, the year 1578 became a turning point that forever changed the fate of the kingdom. The tragic and mysterious disappearance of King Sebastião I in the Battle of Alcaquibir created a vacuum of power, sending shockwaves through the court, the church, and the entire nation. This chapter of uncertainty would challenge the monarchy's legitimacy and bring Catherine of Austria to the forefront of a dynastic crisis. Her role, alongside her husband, Henrique I, would become one of both political stewardship and deep personal sacrifice. The catastrophic Battle of Alcaquibir. Sebastião I, the young king of Portugal, was beloved by the people, but his reign had been marked by youthful ambition and impulsiveness. In 1578, at the age of just 24, he led the Portuguese army to Morocco in an attempt to assert Portuguese dominance over the region. His decision to invade Morocco was not just a military campaign, it was an attempt to expand Portugal's influence, to demonstrate strength, and to fulfill a sense of divine destiny. However, the battle at Alcaquibir proved disastrous. Sebastião's forces were overwhelmed by a much larger Moroccan army, and the Portuguese king himself vanished without a trace. Some rumors claimed he was killed in the battle, others suggested he had been captured. But there was no body. No definitive proof. The uncertainty surrounding his fate became a source of national grief and confusion. With no clear heir to the throne, the monarchy was left in a precarious state. As the days passed and Sebastião's disappearance seemed permanent, the throne of Portugal was left without a rightful successor. The Portuguese court, gripped by a sense of fear and unease, turned its gaze toward potential claimants, men with royal blood but no direct connection to the young king. The succession crisis, the uncertainty of the throne. Sebastião I's death left a nation in turmoil. Without an heir, Portugal found itself in a moment of deep uncertainty. The absence of a legitimate successor to the throne threatened to destabilize the kingdom. The House of Aviz, the royal family to which Sebastião belonged, had no clear heir following his death, creating a deep crisis in Portuguese governance. In the absence of Sebastião I, the focus shifted to Henrique I, the Cardinal of Portugal. Henrique, a member of the royal family, was well connected politically and had long been considered a potential contender for the throne. His position was unique, as he was already a cardinal in the Catholic Church. His ecclesiastical title was an obstacle to his becoming king, as it was traditionally forbidden for a cardinal to hold political power. However, as the political and religious situation became increasingly dire, Henrique's candidacy seemed inevitable. The throne needed a ruler, and Henrique, despite his religious vows, was seen as the most viable candidate. For Catherine, the sudden turn of events came with a personal dilemma. The crisis of succession placed an immense burden on her shoulders. As the wife of Henrique, she was at the center of the power struggle, and her role in the coming transition would be more important than ever. The uncertainty surrounding the throne only intensified the political landscape, making her presence in the court crucial. Catherine's role, a diplomatic pillar. As Portugal grappled with the possibility of losing its monarchy or falling into civil war, Catherine, with her diplomatic acumen and political ties, became a stabilizing force at the Portuguese court. She worked tirelessly to maintain order and peace during these chaotic months. Catherine's marriage to Henrique was not only one of love but also one of political strategy. With her deep ties to the Habsburg family, she understood the value of alliances. The Habsburgs were among the most influential royal families in Europe, and Catherine's position at the court allowed her to foster vital connections with key European powers. She worked to ensure that Portugal did not fall into isolation, maintaining strong diplomatic relationships with Spain, France, and the papacy. Though Catherine was a queen consort by title, her influence was far more substantial. She had a unique ability to navigate the complex political and religious tensions that enveloped Portugal. Her Catholic faith, shared with her husband, helped consolidate support for Henrique's claim to the throne. But Catherine's influence extended beyond the church. Her strategic alliances and her careful political maneuvering helped secure Henrique's position as king. Despite his lack of direct royal lineage, Henrique I ascends the throne. In 1578, as the monarchy teetered on the edge of collapse, Henrique I was crowned King of Portugal. His ascension was not an easy one. It was fraught with political maneuvering and the weight of history pressing down upon him. As the Cardinal of Portugal, his transition from ecclesiastical leader to monarch was controversial. Henrique's coronation was seen by many as a necessary but deeply unconventional choice in an era where the Catholic Church's influence was both vast and controlling. Catherine's support during Henrique's rise to power was vital. Though some factions within the kingdom questioned his legitimacy, Catherine's diplomatic ties and her influence at court helped secure Henrique's rule. As queen consort, she became an active participant in his reign, not merely a ceremonial figure. Her involvement in securing the succession and guiding Henrique through the challenges of ruling a fractured nation was indispensable. She became his most trusted advisor, working behind the scenes to keep the Portuguese court united and ensuring that Henrique's reign began with as much stability as possible. Personal struggles, the burden of the throne. While Catherine's diplomatic efforts were crucial to Henrique's success, the personal toll on her was immense. As a devout Catholic, Catherine was deeply troubled by the unconventional nature of Henrique's ascent to the throne. She struggled with the idea of her husband becoming king while still holding his cardinal title, a position that traditionally barred him from ruling. This conflict between religious vows and political necessity created a tension in Catherine's heart. But despite these personal struggles, Catherine remained resolute. Her sense of duty to her husband and her kingdom outweighed her personal conflicts. She understood that the stability of Portugal depended on Henrique's reign and that her own role was integral in ensuring its success. Catherine, though troubled, never wavered in her commitment to supporting Henrique through the uncertain years that lay ahead. The Church and the Crown, a fragile alliance. Henrique's reign marked a critical period for the Catholic Church in Portugal. The Counter-Reformation was at its height, and the Catholic monarchs of Europe, including Henrique and Catherine, worked tirelessly to suppress Protestantism in their territories. As a devout Catholic, Henrique was committed to ensuring that the Church retained its influence in Portugal. However, his dual role as both a monarch and a cardinal made this relationship particularly delicate. Catherine's unwavering support for the Church's authority helped Henrique navigate this delicate balance. Her diplomatic and religious influence allowed him to maintain the Church's support, while her political maneuvering kept Portugal aligned with Catholic Europe. Catherine played a central role in fortifying Henrique's position, making sure that he had both religious and secular backing. The shifting sands. The threat from Spain. As Henrique's rule solidified, another challenge loomed on the horizon. Spain, under Philip II, had long been eyeing Portugal. The question of Portuguese independence became a pressing issue. Spain's ambitions in the Iberian Peninsula would eventually lead to the Iberian Union in 1580. But for now, Portugal stood as a proud and independent kingdom, albeit one in a precarious situation. Without an heir and beset by internal strife, Catherine's diplomatic ties to the Habsburgs and her knowledge of European politics would prove invaluable in the coming years, as Portugal's independence faced its greatest test. As Henrique I ascended the throne amidst the uncertain backdrop of Portuguese succession, the country's future hung in the balance. The tragic disappearance of King Sebastião I had thrown the kingdom into turmoil, and the throne's legitimacy was questioned from multiple angles. Catherine of Austria, now Queen Consort of Portugal, would prove to be the steady hand that helped guide the kingdom through its most vulnerable period. Her strategic diplomacy, unwavering support of her husband, and understanding of the delicate balance between religious and political forces were crucial in solidifying Henrique's reign. A kingdom in need of stability. Despite the events surrounding Sebastião I's disappearance, Portugal was not alone in facing dynastic uncertainty. Across Europe, the late 16th century was marked by dynastic crises, with rulers facing the growing challenges of consolidating power and maintaining influence. For Portugal, the struggle was particularly acute. A kingdom that had long prided itself on its independence, and one that had suffered immensely from military defeat in the Battle of Alcaquibir, now found itself with a ruler who was not only a cardinal but also lacked a clear male heir. Henrique's ascent to the throne was vital not only for his own political survival but also for the kingdom's continuity. However, this new monarch faced numerous challenges, both external and internal. Portugal's position on the world stage was precarious, particularly with the growing power of Spain, under Philip II, looming over the Iberian Peninsula. The absence of an heir and the growing questions surrounding the legitimacy of Henrique's reign only made these challenges more pronounced. In these difficult circumstances, Catherine stepped into a pivotal role. As the wife of Henrique, she knew her influence at court would be tested. Her political and diplomatic skills, honed in the court of the Habsburgs, would be invaluable in securing the stability of the monarchy. While Henrique was preoccupied with the challenges of ruling, Catherine used her position to secure vital alliances, reassure the people of Portugal, and push back against the uncertainty that threatened their reign. Catherine's diplomatic influence, the Habsburg connection. One of Catherine's greatest strengths was her ability to leverage the power of the Habsburg dynasty. As a member of the Habsburg family, she was uniquely positioned to navigate the intricate web of European diplomacy. Ferdinand I, her father, was Holy Roman Emperor, and her brother Maximilian II reigned over the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburgs were not only an influential royal house but also key players in the battle between Catholicism and Protestantism. Catherine understood that the preservation of Portugal's Catholic identity was crucial not only for her husband's legitimacy but also for maintaining the kingdom's alliances with other Catholic powers in Europe. Catherine worked tirelessly to keep the Habsburgs aligned with Portugal. She used her familial ties to ensure that the Habsburgs provided support for Henrique's reign. Additionally, she helped reinforce Portugal's position in Catholic Europe by solidifying ties with the Papal States and Pope Gregory XIII, ensuring that the Church's support for Henrique would remain unwavering. Through her efforts, Catherine was able to maintain Portugal's place within the broader Catholic sphere, positioning the country as a strong ally to both the Habsburgs and the Church. Her diplomatic skills were also key in strengthening Portugal's ties with Spain. Despite the growing tension between the two Iberian powers, while Philip II sought to extend his influence over Portugal, Catherine's careful handling of the political situation helped keep Spain at bay. She understood that Portugal's autonomy could only be preserved if it maintained strong diplomatic relationships. And it was her relationship with the Habsburgs that helped fortify this position. Catherine's role in internal politics, a queen's influence. At the Portuguese court, Catherine was far from a passive observer. As queen consort, her role was critical in consolidating the support of the nobility and maintaining peace within the kingdom. With the political instability caused by the loss of Sebastião I, many factions within the court saw Henrique's reign as weak or illegitimate. This internal division was exacerbated by the lack of a clear heir to the throne, which made Henrique vulnerable to challenges from rival factions. Catherine, however, was not just the supportive wife, she was an active participant in the political life of the court. Using her intelligence and strategic thinking to navigate this complicated landscape. In her role as queen, Catherine helped broker peace among the various factions within the court. She understood that her husband's success depended on the unity of the kingdom, and she worked tirelessly to prevent division from undermining his reign. Through her efforts, Catherine strengthened Henrique's position, ensuring that he had the support of the nobility and key political figures. Her ability to manage the royal court and deal with internal conflicts was an invaluable asset to Henrique. While he focused on larger political and military concerns, Catherine's insight into court politics kept the kingdom united and functioning smoothly. She became the intermediary between various factions, helping to calm tensions and ensure that Henrique's leadership remained uncontested. The question of succession, the absence of an heir. One of the most pressing issues that Henrique and Catherine faced was the question of succession. The absence of an heir was not just a personal issue for the couple, it was a national crisis. A kingdom without an heir was one on the brink of instability. And the lack of a male successor to the throne put the entire future of the monarchy in jeopardy. Henrique and Catherine had been married for several years by the time he ascended to the throne. But they had no children together. This created a precarious situation for Portugal, as the nobility began to question the future of the royal family. Would the throne pass to distant relatives? Would Portugal be plunged into further turmoil as factions fought for power? For Catherine, the issue of succession was deeply personal. As a queen consort, she understood the significance of providing an heir for the throne. The failure to do so would not only affect her husband's reign but also shape the future of the nation. While Catherine was supportive of Henrique, the absence of an heir weighed heavily on her heart. The pressure to produce an heir was a constant source of stress. But it was a challenge she could not control. The growing threat from Spain. While Catherine focused on strengthening Henrique's position domestically, the threat from Spain loomed ever closer. The growing influence of Philip II of Spain and the Iberian Peninsula posed a direct challenge to Portugal's independence. In the years following Henrique's coronation, it became increasingly clear that Philip II viewed Portugal as a potential acquisition. The internal instability in Portugal, coupled with the absence of a clear heir, made the kingdom a prime target for Spanish expansion. As Spain's power grew under Philip II, Catherine's diplomatic skills would once again be put to the test. She worked diligently to keep Portugal's relations with Spain cordial, hoping to avoid a direct conflict between the two nations. However, the political situation was increasingly difficult to navigate, and Portugal's vulnerability became apparent to all. Catherine's role in the coming conflict would be crucial. She had to balance her loyalty to her husband, Henrique, with the demands of European politics. As the specter of Spanish intervention grew larger, Catherine's influence in the court and on the international stage became even more critical. Catherine's enduring legacy, Through her political and diplomatic efforts, Catherine was able to stabilize Henrique's reign in the face of monumental challenges. Her contributions to his rule, both within Portugal and in the broader European context, solidified her place in history as one of the most influential consorts of her time. While her efforts were ultimately not enough to secure Portugal's independence in the long term, her impact was undeniable. She helped to protect Portugal's Catholic identity, maintained its alliances with key European powers, and worked tirelessly to preserve the unity of the kingdom. Catherine's legacy, though often overshadowed by the political turmoil of the period, endures as a testament to the power of diplomatic skill and the importance of consorts in shaping the fate of nations. As Henrique I began his reign, navigating the complexities of political intrigue, dynastic crises, and the growing threat from Spain, one of the central pillars of his rule was the relationship between the crown and the Catholic Church. For Catherine of Austria, this connection was not only a matter of political necessity but a deeply personal conviction. Her faith, along with her strategic understanding of the political power of the Church, would become a defining feature of her influence in Portugal and the broader European landscape. This section of the story explores how Catherine's devout Catholicism and her connection to the Church helped shape her role in strengthening both her husband's rule and Portugal's position in a deeply religious Europe. Catherine's religious convictions. A devout Catholic queen, Catherine of Austria was not just a political figure, she was a woman of deep faith. Raised in the heart of Catholic Europe, within the Habsburg family, Catherine had been taught from a young age the importance of maintaining Catholicism as the central force in both personal life and political governance. Her family, especially her father Ferdinand I, had been staunch defenders of Catholic orthodoxy, and as a young princess, Catherine had learned to appreciate the intertwining of religious devotion and statecraft. Upon her marriage to Henrique I, this devotion became even more pronounced. Henrique himself was deeply committed to the Catholic Church, and his reign was defined by a steadfast dedication to Catholicism, especially in the face of the Protestant Reformation that was sweeping through much of Europe. Together, Catherine and Henrique were bound by their shared religious values, and the Catholic faith would become a critical aspect of their reign. While Catherine's political acumen and her diplomatic prowess were vital to maintaining the stability of the kingdom, her religious influence within the court of Portugal was just as significant. As Queen Consort, Catherine became an essential ally of the Church, aligning her actions with papal interests and using her position to reinforce Catholic teachings across the realm. The Catholic Church and Portugal, a strong partnership. The Church had always held considerable sway in Portugal, as it did throughout Catholic Europe. The Portuguese monarchy and the clergy had a long history of close ties, with the monarchs relying on the Church for both spiritual guidance and political support. During the reign of Henrique I, these connections became increasingly vital, as the crown sought to assert its authority amidst both domestic unrest and the looming threat of Protestantism. Catherine understood that her role as Queen Consort was not only to support Henrique politically but also to serve as a spiritual anchor for the kingdom. She worked tirelessly to solidify Portugal's allegiance to the Catholic Church, ensuring that her husband's reign was supported by the religious establishment. Her influence was particularly important during the early years of Henrique's reign, as the country struggled with both internal dissent and external threats from Protestant Europe. Through her connections to the Habsburg family and the papacy, Catherine was able to secure support for Henrique's rule from key religious leaders. She played a crucial role in strengthening the relationship between the Portuguese crown and the Vatican, aligning Portugal's interests with the broader Catholic cause. The Jesuit influence, Catherine's support for Catholic education and missionary work. One of the key institutions that Catherine supported during Henrique's reign was the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. The Jesuits were an order of priests known for their commitment to education, missionary work, and defending the Catholic faith. Their presence in Portugal during Catherine's time was instrumental in ensuring the strength of Catholicism in the face of Protestantism's growing influence. Catherine was a strong supporter of the Jesuits, and she understood the importance of their educational and missionary efforts. As part of her broader strategy to reinforce Catholic dominance in Portugal, Catherine used her influence to ensure that Jesuit schools were established throughout the kingdom. These institutions became centers of Catholic learning, where the teachings of the Church were passed down to future generations. The Jesuits also played a key role in Portugal's overseas expansion. As Portugal was engaged in trade and exploration, the Jesuits helped spread Catholicism to its colonies in Africa, Asia, and Brazil. Catherine's support for these missionary efforts ensured that Catholicism remained the dominant faith in these far-flung territories, further solidifying Portugal's Catholic identity on the global stage. Catherine's role in religious reforms. In addition to her support for the Jesuits, Catherine was also involved in other religious reforms within Portugal. During her time as Queen Consort, Portugal was undergoing a period of religious upheaval, particularly in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. Catholic monarchs across Europe were determined to defend the Church against the rise of Protestantism, and Catherine was no exception. Through her influence, Catherine worked to suppress any signs of Protestantism in Portugal. She collaborated closely with the Portuguese Inquisition, an institution that had long served to root out heresy and maintain religious orthodoxy. While the Inquisition's methods were often harsh, Catherine saw it as a necessary tool for preserving the Catholic faith in her kingdom. Catherine's support for the Inquisition was part of her broader strategy to ensure that Portugal remained firmly Catholic. In a time of growing religious tension in Europe, she believed that maintaining religious unity within the kingdom was critical to its survival. Her efforts to strengthen the Church's presence in Portugal helped preserve its dominance and allowed the monarchy to maintain its close ties with the Vatican. The papacy in Portugal. Catherine's relationship with Pope Gregory XIII. Catherine's deep ties to the Habsburg family also facilitated her relationship with the Papal States. Her family's influence in Rome allowed Catherine to maintain a strong connection with the Pope, particularly Pope Gregory XIII, who was the leader of the Catholic Church during the early years of Henrique I's reign. Pope Gregory XIII was a key ally in the Catholic Church's efforts to counter the Protestant Reformation. He supported Catholic monarchs throughout Europe, offering them spiritual legitimacy and backing for their religious policies. Through her connections to the Pope, Catherine was able to secure Gregory XIII's support for Henrique's rule, further solidifying his legitimacy as king in the eyes of both the Church and the people of Portugal. Catherine's relationship with the Pope also helped strengthen Portugal's position within the broader Catholic world. By maintaining close ties with the Vatican, Catherine ensured that Portugal's Catholic identity was preserved, even in the face of external pressures from Protestant powers like England and the Netherlands. Catherine's personal faith, a queen's spiritual journey. While Catherine's religious influence was deeply entwined with her political responsibilities, her faith was also a personal journey. Throughout her life, Catherine remained a deeply spiritual woman. Her devotion to the Catholic faith was not merely a political tool, it was a central aspect of her identity. She found comfort and solace in her faith, particularly as she faced the challenges of being a queen consort during such tumultuous times. Catherine's personal faith was evident in the way she supported religious institutions and in her charitable works. She became known for her generosity toward the poor and for her dedication to ensuring that the Catholic faith was passed down to future generations. Her belief in the power of the Church and its ability to bring stability to Portugal was unwavering. Though Catherine was often forced to navigate the difficult political landscape of the time, her spiritual devotion provided her with the strength to persevere. It was this faith, alongside her political acumen, that allowed her to become one of the most influential consorts of her time. A legacy of faith and power. Catherine's influence on the relationship between the Crown and the Church was profound. Through her support for religious reforms, her alliance with the Jesuits, and her close ties with the papacy, Catherine helped ensure that Portugal remained a staunch Catholic kingdom during her time as Queen Consort. Her faith, both personal and political, became a cornerstone of Henrique I's reign, and her legacy as a defender of Catholicism endured long after her death. As the winds of change swept through Europe, Catherine's role in strengthening the Catholic Church in Portugal was critical in maintaining the kingdom's identity. Her tireless work in supporting the religious institutions of Portugal ensured that the crown remained aligned with the Church, which ultimately played a crucial role in shaping the kingdom's future. As Henrique I settled into his reign, The political landscape of Portugal became increasingly defined by the looming presence of Spain. Under the rule of Philip II, the Iberian Peninsula, with its complex web of dynastic relationships and territorial ambitions, was on the brink of a significant transformation, one that would affect not only Portugal's sovereignty but also its identity as a Catholic nation. For Catherine of Austria, the growing threat from Spain represented a new chapter in her efforts to protect the kingdom she had come to love. While she had worked tirelessly to strengthen Henrique's rule through diplomacy and religious support, the challenge of defending Portugal's independence from Spanish domination would test her abilities as a strategist and diplomat. This chapter explores how Catherine's role as Queen Consort became ever more crucial as the shadow of Spain loomed larger over Portugal. The rise of Philip II, Spain's expanding power. Philip II of Spain was a ruler who understood the delicate balance of power in Europe. His reign marked the peak of Spain's dominance on the world stage. With a vast empire spanning Europe, the Americas, and beyond, under Philip's rule, Spain was a formidable force, and his ambitions extended far beyond his own borders. Philip II had long viewed Portugal as an important piece in his broader vision of Spanish hegemony. Despite the fact that Portugal had enjoyed a separate monarchy since its independence from Leon in the 12th century, the Spanish crown had long harbored aspirations to bring Portugal under its control. The Habsburg family, to which Catherine belonged, had ties to both Spain and Portugal, but the dynamics of those connections were shifting as the political situation grew more complicated. The death of Sebastião I in the disastrous Battle of Alcaquibir, 1578, followed by the instability caused by Henrique's uncertain ascension to the throne, provided Philip II with the perfect opportunity to intervene. With no clear male heir to the Portuguese throne, Philip saw the moment as a chance to consolidate power and bring Portugal under Spanish control, especially given that Henrique, despite his coronation, was without a male heir and was already in his later years. Catherine's role in defending Portugal's sovereignty. As the Spanish threat loomed larger, Catherine of Austria became an even more prominent figure in Portuguese politics. Though she was a foreigner by birth, she had become deeply attached to Portugal during her years as Queen Consort. Her loyalty to Henrique, combined with her strong sense of duty to the kingdom, pushed her to defend Portugal's independence with every tool at her disposal. Catherine, understanding the delicate political landscape of the Iberian Peninsula, worked tirelessly to forge alliances that would help counter Spain's growing influence. Drawing on her connections with the Habsburg family and her own diplomatic experience, she sought to strengthen Portugal's position by maintaining strong ties with France and other Catholic powers in Europe. At the same time, she worked to keep the Portuguese nobility united under Henrique's reign, preventing internal divisions that could be exploited by external forces. Her role in keeping Portugal's political landscape intact was crucial during this period of increasing instability. While Henrique was consumed with the growing pressure to maintain control over Portugal, Catherine worked behind the scenes to prevent the kingdom from falling into the hands of Spain. Her relationship with the French monarchy, in particular, became vital as a counterbalance to Philip II's ambitions. Catherine used her diplomatic skills to keep France and other European powers aligned with Portugal. Though the situation was becoming increasingly tense, the question of succession, a kingdom without an heir, one of the primary reasons for the Spanish threat to Portugal's independence was the lack of a clear heir to the throne. Henrique I had no children, and his reign was becoming increasingly fragile due to his inability to produce an heir. This uncertainty about the succession fueled tensions both within Portugal and between the kingdom and Spain. Catherine's personal struggles were deeply intertwined with the political instability surrounding the succession issue. As a queen consort, she understood better than anyone the weight of the need for a male heir to ensure the survival of the monarchy. The lack of a clear successor to the throne left Portugal vulnerable to external forces, and Catherine's inability to provide an heir to Henrique further complicated the situation. Despite her personal sorrow, Catherine remained steadfast in her support of Henrique. Knowing that the kingdom's survival depended on his leadership, she became an advocate for policies that would strengthen the monarchy's position and ensure that the crown remained within the hands of the House of Aviz. At the same time, She recognized that the threat of Spanish annexation was becoming ever more real and that Portugal's future depended on securing both a clear succession and the continued support of Catholic Europe. Philip II's claim to the throne. By the late 1570s, Philip II had been eyeing Portugal's throne for years. As a member of the Habsburg family through his mother, Isabella of Portugal, Philip felt that he had a legitimate claim to the Portuguese throne. With no direct heir to the throne following the death of Sebastião I and the coronation of the aging Henrique I, the prospect of Portugal falling under Spanish control seemed inevitable. In 1580, after years of mounting pressure, Philip II made his move. He launched an invasion of Portugal, claiming the throne through a legal right based on his family's Habsburg ties. With his forces in place and Henrique's lack of an heir weakening his position, Philip II's forces quickly overwhelmed the Portuguese defenses. The Iberian Union was a fait accompli. Catherine's emotional and political strain. For Catherine, the Spanish invasion was both a personal and political defeat. Her sense of duty to both her husband and her kingdom made the loss of Portuguese independence a bitter blow. The personal toll of not being able to secure a Portuguese heir, coupled with the realization that her efforts to preserve Portugal's sovereignty had failed, deeply affected Catherine. Yet, she never wavered in her devotion to Henrique or her belief in the importance of defending Portugal's Catholic identity. Even as Philip II's forces marched into Lisbon and formally annexed Portugal, Catherine remained a steadfast figure in the Portuguese court, even though her position as Queen Consort had been rendered largely symbolic. As Spain's authority began to dominate, Catherine's role shifted from one of active governance to that of an elder stateswoman. The end of an era, the Iberian Union. The Iberian Union, the unification of Spain and Portugal under a single monarch, began in earnest with Philip II's conquest in 1580. The Portuguese crown was officially absorbed into Spain, and for the next 60 years, Portugal would be ruled by the Spanish Habsburgs, while Catherine remained in the court of Philip II. Her time in Portugal had come to an end. The Spanish occupation marked the beginning of a new era of political and cultural tension for the Portuguese people. However, Catherine's legacy as a diplomat and queen consort who had fought to preserve Portugal's independence would endure long after the Iberian Union ended in 1640 with the restoration of Portuguese sovereignty. Catherine's legacy, a queen in exile. In the years that followed the annexation of Portugal by Spain, Catherine of Austria continued to play a role in European politics. But her heart remained with the kingdom she had once ruled. She spent the rest of her life in relative obscurity in Austria, living under the shadow of the Spanish monarchy that had conquered her beloved Portugal. Despite the loss of Portugal's independence, Catherine's efforts to preserve the kingdom's sovereignty and Catholic identity remained a testament to her political skill and dedication. Her legacy as a queen who had fought for her country's future continued to be remembered, even in the face of the political realities of the time. The invasion of Portugal by Philip II of Spain in 1580 marked a watershed moment in the history of the kingdom. And for Catherine of Austria, it was a painful end to a chapter of hope, resilience, and political ambition. After years of carefully navigating Portugal's complex internal and external political landscape, the union of the Iberian crowns under Philip II meant the loss of Portuguese sovereignty and a profound personal and political defeat for Catherine and her husband, Henrique I. In this section, we explore the fallout from the Spanish invasion, the emotional toll on Catherine, and the eventual legacy of the union. The invasion, Philip II's strategic move. The Spanish crown had long desired to extend its power and influence over Portugal. With the death of Sebastião I in the Battle of Alcaquibir and the subsequent political instability in the kingdom, the opportunity to annex Portugal under the Spanish Habsburgs became increasingly apparent. Philip II of Spain, already a dominant figure in European politics, claimed a legitimate right to the throne of Portugal through his mother, Isabella of Portugal, who had been the daughter of King Manuel I of Portugal. When Henrique I ascended to the throne in 1578, there was hope that he could restore stability to Portugal. However, his lack of a male heir and the internal divisions within the country left the throne vulnerable to external pressures. By 1580, Philip II saw the moment as ripe for action. He formally laid claim to the throne and began preparations to invade Portugal. Catherine, aware of the growing threat from Spain, attempted to counter Philip II's plans diplomatically. Drawing upon her Habsburg connections and her own political expertise, she worked tirelessly to ensure that Portugal had the support of its allies. She reached out to France, hoping to garner military and political support, but the looming reality of Spain's power, coupled with Portugal's internal instability, proved too great a challenge. The fall of Lisbon, the Spanish occupation. In 1580, Philip II's forces, led by his military commanders, advanced into Portugal. Despite some initial resistance, Henrique I and his supporters were unable to mount a significant defense. Lisbon, the heart of the Portuguese kingdom, fell to the Spanish forces without the level of resistance that many had hoped for. The crown was effectively handed over to Philip II, and with it, the sovereignty of Portugal. The political ramifications of the invasion were immediate. Philip II's annexation of Portugal led to the formation of the Iberian Union, a dynastic union of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns under one monarch. For the next 60 years, Portugal would remain under Spanish control, its political independence stripped away and its royal family marginalized. For Catherine, the Spanish invasion was a crushing blow. Her efforts to secure Portugal's sovereignty had failed, and her role in the court had been dramatically reduced. She watched as the kingdom she had worked so hard to protect was absorbed into Spain. The emotional toll on Catherine was profound. As a queen consort who had always been deeply invested in the political and spiritual well-being of Portugal, the loss was not just a personal defeat but a loss of identity for the Portuguese people. Catherine's role in the aftermath, a queen in the shadow of Spain. Following the fall of Lisbon and the official establishment of the Iberian Union, Catherine's life was forever changed. As the wife of the former king, Henrique I, her position in the Spanish court became increasingly tenuous. Though she remained a member of the royal family, her influence was diminished, and her political role in Portugal was effectively nullified. Catherine spent much of her time in Spain after the invasion, adjusting to a new, unfamiliar reality. The court of Philip II, while still Catholic and aligned with her faith, was a far cry from the environment she had once known in Portugal. Catherine's relationship with her Spanish in-laws, especially Philip II, was formal at best, and the emotional distance between her and the new rulers of Portugal was stark. Despite this, Catherine continued to maintain her dignity and played a limited role in the Spanish court. She acted as a representative of her Habsburg family, occasionally involved in diplomatic affairs between Spain and the other European powers. But her involvement in Portuguese matters was largely symbolic. Portugal, now under Spanish control, had lost much of its independence, and Catherine's power within the kingdom was effectively dissolved. Henrique I's decline and death. In the years following the Spanish invasion, Henrique I's health began to decline. The trauma of the loss of his kingdom, combined with the personal toll of his failure to secure an heir, weighed heavily on him. He had been crowned king amidst uncertainty. And now, after the annexation, his reign seemed to be little more than a footnote in the grand history of the Spanish Empire. Henrique I's death in 1580 came soon after the invasion, and his passing marked the end of an era for the Portuguese monarchy. Though Catherine had been a loyal consort throughout their marriage, she found herself living in a kingdom that no longer existed in its former form. With his death, the Habsburgs' grip on the Portuguese throne became absolute, and Catherine was left to mourn not just her husband but the kingdom she had loved and fought for. Catherine's emotional and political struggles. The emotional impact of the Spanish invasion and the subsequent annexation of Portugal was profound for Catherine. She had spent much of her life in Portugal, first as a young princess consort and later as queen, and her heart remained with the kingdom even as it slipped into the hands of Spain. For Catherine, the loss of Portugal's independence was a personal failure, even though she had done everything within her power to defend the kingdom. The fact that she was unable to prevent the invasion and the subsequent union with Spain weighed heavily on her. But her dedication to her husband, her faith, and her people remained unwavering. Despite the personal sorrow she experienced, Catherine remained strong. She continued to live under the shadow of the Spanish court, where she was treated with a mixture of respect and distance. Though no longer a political force in Portugal, She held on to the legacy of her role in the kingdom and continued to advocate for the well-being of her fellow Portuguese citizens. Even in exile. The Iberian Union. A divided kingdom. The annexation of Portugal and the establishment of the Iberian Union marked the beginning of a difficult period for both Spain and Portugal. While the Union helped consolidate Spanish power, it also created friction between the two nations. The Portuguese people resented being ruled by a foreign monarch, and the royal family's ties to the Habsburgs became a symbol of their loss of sovereignty. For Catherine, the Iberian Union was a sad chapter in her life. Despite the fact that she had supported her husband and fought to protect Portugal's sovereignty, the reality of the Union meant that her beloved country was no longer a political entity unto itself. Catherine's role, too, shifted from being a powerful consort and advisor to that of a quiet royal widow, overshadowed by the vast reach of the Spanish Empire. The legacy of Catherine's struggle. Though Catherine's active role in Portuguese politics had come to an end with the invasion, her legacy lived on in the hearts of the Portuguese people. As a queen consort who had fought to preserve her kingdom's independence and maintain its Catholic identity, Catherine was remembered for her efforts to defend Portugal, even in the face of insurmountable odds. In time, Portugal would regain its independence in 1640, but Catherine's influence would never be forgotten. Her legacy as a steadfast defender of her kingdom and a woman of great personal and political strength would continue to inspire future generations of Portuguese monarchs and nobles. The annexation of Portugal by Spain under Philip II in 1580 not only marked a personal defeat for Catherine of Austria but also signified the end of an era for Portugal as an independent nation. The formation of the Iberian Union saw the Portuguese crown effectively absorbed by the Spanish monarchy, a situation that would persist for the next 60 years. As one of the most significant moments in Portuguese history, the consequences of this union reverberated far beyond the political realm, affecting the very identity and cultural fabric of the country. In this chapter, we will delve deeper into Catherine's role in the post-invasion period, her continued resistance to the Spanish occupation, her personal struggles in the Spanish court, and how her legacy endured in the face of political adversity. The aftermath of the Iberian Union. The fall of Lisbon to Philip II's forces in 1580 had marked a catastrophic defeat for Portugal, and the formal annexation of the kingdom into Spain was a symbolic and definitive blow to Portuguese sovereignty. From this moment onward, Portugal ceased to be a separate entity on the international stage. The political structure of Portugal was now subject to the Spanish crown's rule, though its administrative and social traditions were largely left intact for the time being. The Portuguese nobility, many of whom had aligned themselves with Henrique I and supported the vision of an independent Portugal, were faced with the grim reality of Spanish rule. Philip II moved quickly to consolidate his power over the kingdom by asserting control over key institutions, appointing Spanish officials to important positions, and reaffirming his right to rule the Portuguese colonies across the world. The empire that Portugal had once proudly commanded was now under the influence of a foreign monarch. For Catherine of Austria, this loss of sovereignty was a devastating blow. Despite her efforts to maintain political alliances with the Habsburgs, her position as queen consort was now diminished. The once vibrant Portuguese court, where she had been a respected figure, was now effectively a shadow of its former self. Her personal connection to Portugal and her loyalty to the kingdom of her late husband, Henrique, made the political shift even more painful to endure. Catherine in the Spanish court, a queen consort without a kingdom. Following the annexation of Portugal, Catherine found herself navigating a complex and uncomfortable position within the Spanish court. Although she retained her royal title as a member of the Habsburg family, she was now a widow and a queen consort without a kingdom. She had no formal role in the Spanish government, and the social and political distance between herself and her Spanish in-laws, particularly Philip II, was palpable. While Spain under Philip II continued to uphold Catholicism as its official religion, the monarch's policies on political consolidation and military expansion did not align with Catherine's ideals of governance. She was still, in many ways, a queen in exile, residing in a foreign court where her influence was minimal and her connection to her homeland increasingly strained. As a foreigner in Spain, Catherine found herself isolated from the Portuguese people, and the emotional toll of her exile was considerable. However, Catherine was no stranger to loss and hardship. Throughout her life, she had dealt with political setbacks and personal challenges. The loss of Portugal's independence was a deep wound, but Catherine's resilience allowed her to maintain a sense of dignity. Despite her diminished status in the Spanish court, her quiet resistance, preserving Portugal's legacy. Though Catherine's political power was limited, her deep love for Portugal and its people remained unwavering. Despite being sidelined in the Spanish court, Catherine continued to advocate for the well-being of her homeland. She used whatever influence she had within the Habsburg family to speak up for the Portuguese, who now found themselves under the rule of a foreign king. Catherine's quiet resistance to Spanish rule was not just political but also cultural. She took an active interest in preserving the cultural identity of Portugal within the Spanish Empire. She supported efforts to keep Portuguese traditions, language, and customs alive, particularly in the Portuguese colonies. Through her personal relationships within the royal family, she continued to stress the importance of Portugal's unique role in Europe and the wider world, urging Spain to maintain a level of autonomy for the kingdom within the Iberian Union. Catherine's efforts in this regard would have little immediate impact on the political realities of the Iberian Union, but her advocacy would resonate with future generations of Portuguese patriots who would fight for independence once again. In many ways, her efforts in the Spanish court helped lay the groundwork for the eventual Portuguese Restoration War, 1640, which would see Portugal regain its independence. The decline of Catherine's influence. As time passed, Catherine's influence within the Spanish court continued to wane. She was no longer at the center of political life, as she had been in her earlier years in Portugal. The focus of the Spanish monarchy shifted to the complexities of managing the vast empire, which now included both Spain and Portugal. Catherine's position as a royal widow with no direct claim to the throne rendered her more of a symbolic figure than a political force. Despite her diminished role, Catherine's legacy was not one of complete obscurity. Her connection to the Habsburgs and her status as a former Queen Consort of Portugal allowed her to remain a respected figure within European royal circles. However, her life in Spain after the invasion was marked by solitude and the painful reality of her inability to prevent the loss of her beloved kingdom. The legacy of Catherine's efforts. Though she did not live to see the restoration of Portuguese independence in 1640. Catherine's legacy lived on. Her dedication to preserving Portugal's Catholic identity, her diplomatic efforts to maintain its alliances, and her emotional commitment to the kingdom created a lasting impact on the historical consciousness of the Portuguese people. Catherine's personal sacrifices, her quiet resistance to the Spanish occupation, and her continued advocacy for the Portuguese cause inspired those who would later fight to restore the country's independence. Though the Iberian Union had claimed Portugal for a time, the identity of the nation and the memory of its former queen consort, Catherine of Austria, remained steadfast in the hearts of its people. Catherine's final years, a queen without a kingdom. In her final years, Catherine lived in Vienna, largely in the shadow of the Spanish monarchy, though her status as a member of the Habsburg family afforded her some respect. The emotional toll of losing Portugal and her role as a consort without a kingdom left her feeling somewhat removed from the political dramas that played out around her. However, Catherine never fully relinquished her affection for Portugal, and her personal history was forever intertwined with the fate of the country she had loved. She passed away quietly, without ever seeing Portugal restored to independence. But her legacy as a defender of the kingdom's sovereignty and its Catholic identity endured long after her death. Catherine of Austria had, in her own way, fought for Portugal's place in the world, long after she had been physically removed from the land she had once called home. Following the annexation of Portugal and the formal establishment of the Iberian Union under Philip II, Catherine of Austria found herself in a position of exile, away from her beloved Portugal. The loss of her homeland and the dissolution of her political power as the queen consort of a now subjugated kingdom were difficult realities to reconcile. Despite this, Catherine's dignity and resilience shone through as she navigated the difficult years in the Spanish court and eventually returned to her family in Austria. Her life in exile was marked by reflection, a deepening spiritual life, and an unwavering commitment to the memory of Portugal. Though far from the political intrigues of the Iberian Peninsula, Catherine remained a figure of respect within the Habsburg family and the broader European royal circles. However, her final years would be defined by a quiet existence. Far from the courtly life she once led, Catherine's returned to Austria, a queen in the shadows. In the aftermath of the Iberian Union, Catherine returned to her homeland, Austria, where she lived the remainder of her years in relative obscurity. Though she was still a member of the Habsburg family, the political landscape of Europe had shifted dramatically. Philip II had consolidated his power, and the Habsburg dynasty was now focused on managing its extensive territories. With Catherine's branch of the family relegated to the sidelines of European affairs. Living in Vienna, Catherine was close to her brother, Maximilian II, the Holy Roman Emperor, but her role at court was no longer central. She had once been a queen consort, a powerful political figure, but now, in the twilight years of her life, Catherine's influence was diminished. She was no longer involved in the political decisions that shaped Europe, and instead, she became a more distant figure, respected for her royal connections but largely removed from active political life. Despite the decline in her political power, Catherine found solace in the support of her family and her deep religious faith. Her Catholic convictions had always been an important part of her identity. And in her final years, she immersed herself more fully in religious life. The quiet life of a widow, away from the courts and political maneuvering, allowed Catherine the space to reflect on the events of her life and her love for the Kingdom of Portugal, which she had fought so fiercely to protect. A life of faith, Catherine's spiritual journey. One of the most striking aspects of Catherine's final years was her return to a more personal, spiritual existence. Throughout her life, Catherine had been a devout Catholic, and her faith had played a crucial role in her actions and decisions, both as a queen consort and as a political figure. In her later years, away from the pressure of the royal court, Catherine devoted herself to a life of prayer and reflection. Her religious devotion was not just a private matter but also a way for her to continue her support for the Catholic Church and its teachings. Catherine, who had once used her political position to advance the interests of the Church in Portugal, now spent her time supporting charitable causes and engaging in acts of piety. Her quiet life in Austria allowed her to reconnect with her spiritual roots, finding comfort in the rituals and practices that had sustained her throughout her tumultuous life. In the absence of political power and royal duties, Catherine found peace in the simplicity of religious life. She visited convents, participated in religious ceremonies, and was a patron of several charitable organizations. The same sense of duty that had once driven her to defend Portugal now found expression in a quieter, more personal way. Catherine's faith became a source of strength, and it allowed her to make peace with the many disappointments and losses she had suffered in her life. The shadow of Portugal, a kingdom in her heart. Though Catherine spent her final years in Austria, Portugal remained a central part of her heart and mind. She never stopped grieving the loss of her homeland, and in her quiet moments, she often reflected on the Portugal she had once known. She had lived through some of the most difficult and politically charged years in the kingdom's history. And though the Iberian Union was a painful defeat, Catherine's devotion to Portugal did not waver. In private, Catherine would often speak of her dreams of seeing Portugal free from Spanish control. She continued to support the efforts of those who would eventually bring about the Portuguese Restoration War in 1640. Though she would not live to see the moment when Portugal regained its independence, her hope for the future of Portugal remained steadfast, and she found solace in knowing that the Portuguese people had the strength to rise again. Even if it would not happen in her lifetime, Catherine's quiet resistance, even in her final years, contributed to the myth of the lost Portugal, a nation that had once stood proud and independent, only to be subsumed by the power of Spain. Her legacy as a queen who had fought for Portugal's sovereignty was woven into the fabric of the country's history, and her name remains synonymous with the struggle for independence. Catherine's final days, a queen at peace. In the early 1600s, after a life marked by personal sacrifice, political turmoil, and a deep commitment to her faith and her homeland, Catherine of Austria passed away quietly in Vienna. At the age of 67, she had outlived her husband, Henrique I, and had seen the political collapse of the kingdom she had once ruled. Yet, despite these losses, her final years were marked by a sense of peace, a peace that came from her unwavering faith and her quiet resignation to the will of God. Catherine was buried in the Kapuzinergruft in Vienna, alongside her Habsburg relatives, where her tomb is a simple one, reflective of the modesty that had come to define her life in her later years. Though her name would eventually fade from the public eye, Catherine's impact on Portuguese history and the legacy of her devotion to both Portugal and the Catholic faith would endure in the hearts of those who remembered her. Her death marked the end of a chapter in the struggle for Portuguese independence. But it also signaled the beginning of the myth of Catherine, a queen who had fought fiercely for her kingdom and her people, only to watch it fall under foreign rule. Her life was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the face of overwhelming odds. The enduring legacy of Catherine. Catherine's legacy lived on, not just in the annals of history but in the hearts of the Portuguese people. Though the Iberian Union lasted until 1640, and Catherine did not see Portugal's restoration to independence, her life and sacrifices were not forgotten. In time, Portugal would rise again, freed from Spanish rule, and when that moment arrived, the memory of Catherine of Austria, the queen who had fought for Portugal with unwavering faith, would endure as a symbol of the kingdom's resilience and hope. Though Catherine of Austria passed away in relative obscurity in Vienna, far from her beloved Portugal, her influence continued to reverberate through the corridors of Portuguese history long after her death. Her efforts to protect Portugal's independence and her deep commitment to the kingdom's Catholic identity became integral parts of the collective memory of the Portuguese people. Even as the Iberian Union subsided and Portugal regained its sovereignty, Catherine's legacy remained entwined with the struggle for freedom and national pride. In this chapter, we will explore how Catherine's impact shaped Portugal in the years following the annexation and the eventual restoration of the Portuguese monarchy in 1640. Though she did not live to witness the moment of Portugal's resurgence, her role as a steadfast defender of the kingdom's identity continued to inspire those who fought for its independence. The Portuguese Restoration War, the struggle for independence, the Iberian Union, which had begun in 1580 with the annexation of Portugal by Spain, lasted for nearly 60 years. During this period, the Portuguese people endured foreign rule under Spanish kings, who imposed their own policies on the once proud kingdom. The Iberian Union was deeply unpopular in Portugal, where resistance to Spanish control simmered beneath the surface. Many Portuguese nobles, intellectuals, and commoners longed for a return to their country's sovereignty and independence. Though Catherine of Austria did not live to see the events that led to the restoration of Portugal's independence, her legacy was a powerful influence on the Portuguese nobility and resistance movements. The myth of Catherine, the queen who had fought so tirelessly to defend Portugal, became a symbol of the kingdom's resilience. Her efforts were remembered and romanticized by those who sought to restore Portuguese independence. The Portuguese Restoration War officially began in 1640. Nearly 60 years after Catherine's death, when a rebellion broke out in Lisbon. The Portuguese nobility, along with military leaders, rose up against Spanish rule, demanding the restoration of their sovereignty. The rebellion quickly gathered support from various factions within Portugal, including those who had been inspired by Catherine's steadfast defense of Portugal's identity. Catherine's role as a defender of Portugal's Catholic faith and her efforts to prevent the loss of the nation's culture and traditions were remembered as powerful motivators for the Restoration movement. Her commitment to the survival of Portugal's Catholicism in the face of external threats became a rallying cry for those seeking to expel the Spanish and restore Portuguese independence. The role of Catherine's memory in the Restoration movement. While Catherine was not alive to see the restoration of Portugal, the memory of her sacrifices and her relentless advocacy for the kingdom's sovereignty played a significant role in the rebellion. Leaders of the Portuguese Restoration War, including João IV, who would eventually become the king of restored Portugal, used Catherine's legacy as a symbol of the nation's endurance. Catherine's commitment to the preservation of Portugal's Catholic identity and its independence was often cited as an inspiration for the national cause. The Habsburg connection was also instrumental in the Restoration movement. Catherine, as a member of the Habsburg family, had spent much of her life working to maintain strong alliances for Portugal within Catholic Europe. Her efforts to keep Portugal aligned with the Habsburgs and the Papal States during the period of the Iberian Union created a network of support that would later prove valuable when the Portuguese sought to break free from Spanish domination. In the years following Catherine's death, the memory of her struggle against Spanish rule continued to inspire generations of Portuguese leaders and citizens. The restoration of Portuguese independence in 1640 was a momentous event, and those who fought for it saw it as the fulfillment of the legacy that Catherine had left behind, a legacy of resilience, resistance, and loyalty to the country she had fought so hard to preserve. The end of the Iberian Union and the restoration of Portuguese sovereignty. In 1640, after years of turmoil and resistance, the Portuguese succeeded in overthrowing Spanish rule. The Restoration War culminated in the declaration of Portuguese independence, and João IV of the House of Braganza was declared the King of Portugal, marking the end of the Iberian Union and the return of Portugal to its status as an independent kingdom. Catherine's influence in this moment, though indirect, was deeply felt. The House of Braganza, which took the throne after the Restoration, had been part of the faction that had sought independence from Spain. The Braganzas, too, were defenders of Portugal's Catholic identity and national sovereignty, values that Catherine had fiercely upheld during her life. The independence of Portugal was celebrated by the Portuguese people as a triumph over foreign domination. The loss of Catherine, her kingdom, and the independence that she had sought to preserve made her memory all the more cherished. As the nation began the long process of rebuilding its identity after more than half a century of Spanish rule, Catherine was remembered as a symbol of what the country had endured, and the hope that had sustained it throughout the darkest times. The legacy of Catherine's struggle in Portuguese memory. Catherine's legacy lived on through the restoration of Portuguese independence and the subsequent consolidation of the Braganza dynasty. Although her direct political influence had ended long before the Restoration, her legacy as a woman who had fought tirelessly for Portugal's sovereignty continued to inspire those who saw her as a martyr for the cause. Her name was evoked in speeches, commemorative writings, and in the collective memory of the Portuguese people. In the years following the Restoration, Catherine's role in preserving Portugal's Catholic identity was also remembered. Portugal's re-establishment as a Catholic kingdom, free from foreign rule, was seen as the fulfillment of her lifelong mission to protect and nurture her country's faith and culture. Her influence extended beyond politics into the cultural and spiritual realms, ensuring that her memory lived on in the hearts and minds of the Portuguese for generations. Catherine's legacy. A quiet queen who shaped a nation. Catherine of Austria, the quiet queen consort who had stood by her husband Henrique I during the turbulent years of their reign, and whose efforts to preserve Portugal's independence and Catholic faith had shaped the course of the kingdom's history, was ultimately a woman of great significance, though she did not live to see the final victory of the Portuguese Restoration War. Her role in that story, through her defense of Portugal, her unwavering support for the Catholic Church, and her diplomatic legacy, was central to the kingdom's ultimate resurgence. Catherine's legacy was that of a woman who fought for her people, who stood in defense of a kingdom that had been torn apart by political machinations and foreign invaders. Her quiet resistance in exile, her support for her homeland, and her efforts to keep Portugal's identity intact in the face of overwhelming odds would resonate through the ages. Long after the wars had ended, her name would be remembered as a symbol of courage, loyalty, and the enduring spirit of a nation that would one day rise again. The story of Catherine of Austria is one woven with passion, sacrifice, and a steadfast devotion to both her faith and her kingdom. Her life unfolded in the grand courts of Europe, her decisions shaping not only her own destiny but that of Portugal, a nation she would forever hold in her heart. From the very first steps of her marriage to Henrique I to her quiet days in exile, Catherine's journey was marked by a relentless commitment to the cause of Portugal's sovereignty and Catholic identity. Although she did not live to see the independence of her homeland, her legacy, one of resistance, hope, and resilience, would continue to influence the trajectory of the kingdom for generations to come. A queen of two worlds. Catherine's life was not simply defined by her royal birth or her marriage to Henrique I. It was shaped by her unique ability to navigate the intricate webs of diplomacy and politics that spanned across Austria, Spain, and Portugal. Raised in the Habsburg court, where religious and political alliances were as important as personal relationships, Catherine was groomed for a life of influence. A life where royal duties were inseparable from the grand strategies of empire building. Yet, it was her heart that ultimately defined her path. Her marriage to Henrique I, though politically arranged, evolved into a union founded on mutual respect and shared values. Together, they faced challenges both internal and external, with Catherine often acting as the diplomat, the strategist, and the emotional anchor. She brought with her a depth of knowledge and political insight, forged through her Habsburg connections, that would prove indispensable in her efforts to safeguard Portugal's interests. Defender of Portugal's independence, Catherine's most significant role in the history of Portugal lay in her unrelenting defense of the kingdom's independence and its Catholic identity. The Iberian Union, the period in which Portugal was annexed by Spain under Philip II, was a dark chapter in the kingdom's history. But it was during this time that Catherine's resilience shone most brightly. Though she could not prevent the annexation, her dedication to her homeland's sovereignty remained unbroken. Her efforts to maintain strong diplomatic relations with Catholic powers, particularly the Habsburgs and the Papal States, were vital in keeping the spirit of independence alive. The memory of her dedication became a rallying cry for those who would later rise against Spanish rule in the Portuguese Restoration War. Catherine's quiet resistance, her work behind the scenes, and her ability to unite the people of Portugal through her legacy made her a central figure in the national consciousness. Even as the Iberian Union seemed all but permanent, the restoration of Portugal and Catherine's enduring legacy. When Portugal finally regained its independence in 1640, nearly 60 years after Catherine's death, the nation celebrated its liberation, but they did not forget the sacrifices made by those who had fought for that freedom, including Catherine of Austria. Though she had passed away many years before, her legacy was woven into the fabric of the Restoration movement. Catherine's name became synonymous with the fight for Portugal's identity, both religious and national. The leaders of the Restoration War invoked her memory as a symbol of Portugal's endurance, a reminder that the kingdom had always been worth fighting for. Her unwavering support for the Catholic Church, her efforts to protect Portuguese culture, and her commitment to her homeland became touchstones for the Restoration movement, guiding the leaders who would bring about the end of the Iberian Union and restore the independence of Portugal. Her contributions were not just political but deeply personal. Catherine's love for Portugal, her faith, and her relentless drive to protect her people from foreign domination left a mark on history that could not be erased. While she had been a queen consort in a time of great political upheaval, she would also be remembered as a woman whose love for her country transcended the temporal and entered the realm of legend. A quiet queen, a resilient nation, Catherine of Austria, in her final years, lived out her days quietly in Vienna, far from the turbulent politics of the Iberian Peninsula. Yet, even in her solitude, she continued to represent the ideals she had always stood for: devotion to faith, loyalty to family, and unyielding dedication to her country. The queen who had once faced the overwhelming power of Spain and witnessed the fall of Portugal's independence was now a quiet symbol of that same nation's spirit. Her tomb in Vienna stands as a testament to her life, a life that was never about personal glory, but about sacrifice for the greater good of a nation. Catherine's legacy, though built on political and religious strategies, was rooted in love, the love of a kingdom, its people, and its faith, and in this love, her memory lived on, even long after her death. Catherine of Austria may not have lived to see the final victory of Portugal, but in the hearts of the Portuguese people, she remained forever a queen whose love for her country transcended time and political boundaries.